When the police stopped and humiliated a black school bus driver in front of his students, they thought no one would object. But the children did something no one expected, setting off a chain reaction that no one could escape. What happened next turned everything upside down. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. In the meantime, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Marlon Davis's modest home, casting soft golden rays across the quiet living room. It was still early, and the neighborhood lay in the sleepy haze of dawn. Marlon was already awake, moving silently through the house so as not to disturb his wife Angela, who was still sleeping upstairs. He had always been an early riser, a habit that had followed him since his military days. Now, as a school bus driver, his mornings began just as early, though the stakes had shifted from battlefields to the bustling streets of the city. As he brewed a pot of coffee, Marlon allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The rich, earthy aroma filled the kitchen, grounding him. Today seemed like it would be just another regular day, nothing out of the ordinary. The same routine: pick up the kids, drive them safely to school, and return them home. It was a job he had grown to love over the past 15 years. It wasn't just about the driving for him, it was about the kids. Many of them came from neighborhoods like his, where opportunities were scarce and life was tough. He saw it as his duty to offer them a brief respite during their rides, a sense of security and normalcy, even if only for the short time they were on his bus. He poured himself a cup of coffee and glanced out the window, watching as the first signs of life began to stir in the quiet streets. The houses, most of them worn by years of weather and hardship, had stood like sentinels in this neighborhood for decades. He knew most of the families who lived in them. Some struggled to make ends meet, while others had already lost the battle. But through it all, the kids, the ones who boarded his bus each morning, remained a flicker of hope. They were his responsibility, and that meant everything to him. Taking a sip of his coffee, Marlon let his thoughts drift to his own son Jamal, who was away at college. He smiled to himself, feeling a swell of pride. Jamal was the first in their family to go to university, and Marlon had made sure that he had everything he needed to succeed. In many ways, driving that school bus had helped make that possible. Every paycheck, every hour spent behind the wheel, was another step toward ensuring his son had a better future. Finishing his coffee, Marlon glanced at the clock. It was time to go. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the kitchen chair and quietly stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The cool morning air greeted him as he made his way to the bus depot, where the familiar yellow buses lined up, waiting for their drivers. The depot was alive with the sounds of engines warming up and drivers chatting about their routes for the day. Marlon greeted his fellow drivers with a nod and a smile, exchanging brief words as they prepared for their shifts. Despite the early hour, there was a sense of camaraderie here, a shared understanding of the responsibility they all carried. As he approached his bus, he ran his hands along the side, checking for any dents or damage from the previous day. It was a habit he had developed over the years, one of those little things that made him feel in control. Satisfied that everything was in order, he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The familiar rumble beneath his feet was comforting, like the steady heartbeat of a trusted companion. Pulling out of the depot, Marlon began his usual route through the neighborhood, picking up the kids at their designated stops. The bus quickly filled with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and the occasional argument. It was always lively, and Marlon wouldn't have had it any other way. He had learned each of the kids' names by heart, knew their families, their stories, their dreams. Deep Blue Corridor. There was Darius, the aspiring basketball star who never stopped dribbling an invisible ball in the aisle. Layla, the quiet one, always sat at the front, nose buried in a book. Marcus, the class clown, loved making everyone laugh, even when it wasn't the right time. Each of these kids had their own struggles, and Marlon knew it. That's why he made sure the bus was a safe space, free from the outside pressures of their lives. On his bus, they were just kids, free to be themselves, if only for the length of the ride to school. Today seemed no different. As he picked up the last group of students, the usual banter filled the air, and Marlon found himself smiling as he caught snippets of their conversations. "You see that new game they just dropped?" Darius asked Marcus from the back of the bus. "Man, I've been saving up for that. It's supposed to be lit," Marcus responded with a wide grin. Marlon shook his head slightly, amused. He didn't always understand their slang, but he appreciated the joy they found in the little things. As they drove through the city, the kids settled into their usual routines. Some talked, others listened to music, and a few even dozed off. Marlon's mind wandered as he kept his eyes on the road, thinking about the weekend. He planned to visit Jamal at college, maybe catch a basketball game or just spend some time together. It had been a few months since he'd seen his son, and he missed him more than he liked to admit. But as they passed into one of the quieter neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, Marlon noticed something unusual. A police car was trailing behind them. Its lights off, but clearly keeping pace with the bus. At first, he didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first time a patrol car had followed him. Sometimes they just monitored school buses to ensure safety. But as he turned onto the main road, the police car's lights flashed on, and the siren let out a short, sharp wail. The bus immediately fell silent. Marlon's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced into the rearview mirror. The kids were all staring out the windows, eyes wide, whispering to one another. "What's going on, Mr. D?" Layla asked softly from the front seat, her book forgotten in her lap. "I'm not sure," Marlon replied, keeping his voice calm. "Just stay seated. Everything's going to be fine." He pulled the bus to the side of the road and watched as the police car came to a stop behind them. Two officers stepped out, both white, both wearing the serious expressions that Marlon had come to know too well. A familiar sense of unease settled in his gut. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over by the police, and he knew exactly what was coming next. Everything was in order. Marlon climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The familiar rumble beneath his feet was comforting, like the steady heartbeat of a trusted companion. Pulling out of the depot, Marlon began his usual route through the neighborhood, picking up the kids at their designated stops. The bus quickly filled with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and the occasional argument. It was always lively, and Marlon wouldn't have had it any other way. He had learned each of the kids' names by heart, knew their families, their stories, their dreams. There was Darius, the aspiring basketball star who never stopped dribbling an invisible ball in the aisle. Leela, the quiet one, always sat at the front, her nose buried in a book. And Marcus, the class clown, who loved making everyone laugh, even when it wasn't the right time. Each of these kids had their own struggles, and Marlon knew it. That's why he made sure the bus was a safe space, free from the outside pressures of their lives. On his bus, they were just kids, free to be themselves, if only for the length of the ride to school. Today seemed no different. As he picked up the last group of students, the usual banter filled the air, and Marlon found himself smiling as he caught snippets of their conversations. "You see that new game they just dropped?" Darius asked Marcus from the back of the bus. "Man, I've been saving up for that. It's supposed to be lit," Marcus responded with a wide grin. Marlon shook his head slightly amused. He didn't always understand their slang, but he appreciated the joy they found in the little things. As they drove through the city, the kids settled into their usual routines. Some talked, others listened to music, and a few even dozed off. Marlon's mind wandered as he kept his eyes on the road, thinking about the weekend. He planned to visit Jamal at college, maybe catch a basketball game or just spend some time together. It had been a few months since he'd seen his son, and he missed him more than he liked to admit. But as they passed into one of the quieter neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, Marlon noticed something unusual. A police car was trailing behind them, its lights off but clearly keeping pace with the bus. At first, he didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first time a patrol car had followed him. Sometimes officers just monitored school buses to ensure safety. But as he turned onto the main road, the police car's lights suddenly flashed on, and the siren let out a short, sharp wail. The bus immediately fell silent. Marlon's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced into the rearview mirror. The kids were all staring out the windows, eyes wide, whispering to one another. "What's going on, Mr. D?" Layla asked softly from the front seat, her book forgotten in her lap. "I'm not sure," Marlon replied, keeping his voice calm. "Just stay seated. Everything's going to be fine." He pulled the bus to the side of the road and watched as the police car came to a stop behind them. 2 officers stepped out, both white, both wearing the serious expressions that Marlon had come to know too well. A familiar sense of unease settled in his gut. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over by the police. He knew exactly what was coming. Marlon could feel it before they even spoke. The way the officers approached, the tension in their steps. He had seen this before. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, walked up to the driver's side window and knocked on it with more force than necessary. Marlon rolled the window down and looked up at him. "Driver's license and registration," the officer demanded, his tone clipped. Marlon nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for his wallet, retrieved the documents, and handed them over, hoping this would be over quickly. The officer didn't move. He flipped through the papers with a deepening frown, his expression unreadable. "What's the problem, officer?" Marlon asked, careful to keep his tone polite. The second officer, a shorter man with a thick mustache, stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the bus. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered. Marlon's heart sank. This wasn't going to be simple. He could feel the kids' eyes on him, waiting, watching. He didn't want to make a scene in front of them, didn't want them to see him like this, but there was no way out now. Keeping his voice calm, he asked, "Can I ask what this is about?" The officer's eyes hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." Marlon hesitated only for a second before he unbuckled his seatbelt and slowly opened the door. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the officer motioned for him to move toward the front of the bus, away from the kids' line of sight. But Marlon knew they were still watching, still recording every move with their phones. "Hands on the hood," the officer barked. Marlon did as he was told, feeling the cold metal of the bus's hood under his palms. His mind raced, trying to figure out how this had escalated so quickly. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't broken any traffic laws. This was supposed to be just another routine day. Behind him, he heard the second officer talking to the kids, trying to assert control. "Everyone stay in your seats. This is a routine check." But Marlon knew better. This wasn't routine. This was something else entirely. The cold metal pressed into Marlon's palms as he kept his hands firmly planted, standing in silence. His heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained calm. Years of experience had taught him that the wrong move, an angry word, a sharp gesture, any of it, could turn a tense situation into a nightmare. But this time, the stakes felt higher. The kids on the bus were his responsibility, and they were watching everything. If this went wrong, the impact would be far worse than his personal humiliation. The officer with the buzz cut stood close behind him, his breath audible. Marlon could hear the faint scribbling of a notepad as the second officer, the one with the thick mustache, leaned against the bus, jotting something down with unnecessary slowness, dragging the moment out. "You driving this bus legally, huh?" the mustached officer asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks a little out of place. You don't fit the picture." Marlon swallowed the anger rising in his throat. "I've got the paperwork. Everything is in order," he said, his voice steady, though the edge in it was impossible to miss. The officer didn't even glance at the papers. Instead, he gave a mocking chuckle. "Yeah, well, we've seen enough fake licenses to know when something's fishy." Behind him, through the windows of the bus, Marlon could hear the low murmur of the kids. Darius, the basketball star, whispered urgently to Marcus, "They're treating him like a criminal for no reason." From the back of the bus, Darius's voice rose. "These ain't right, Mr. D." "Quiet, Darius," Marlon called over his shoulder, trying to project calm, even as frustration boiled under his skin. The last thing he wanted was for one of the kids to say or do something reckless. But it was too late. The buzz-cut officer snapped his head toward the bus and marched up to the door, yanking it open. "Everyone stay in your seats. No one moves, you hear me?" The kids froze, wide-eyed, some still holding their phones up, filming everything. The officer's gaze swept over them, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Put those phones away," he barked. But Darius refused. "Nah, man, we're recording. We got every right. Strut that off right now, kid, or I'll—" "That's enough!" Marlon's voice rang out, louder than usual, firm with uncharacteristic force. The officer turned sharply, his jaw tightening in irritation at being interrupted. Marlon met his gaze steadily, a flicker of anger now visible in his usually calm expression. "They're just kids," Marlon said, his voice low but firm. "You don't need to do this." The buzz-cut officer stalked back toward Marlon, standing uncomfortably close. "I'll decide what needs to be done," he muttered. Then, louder, he ordered, "Hands back on the hood." Marlon complied, glancing sideways just long enough to see Darius holding his phone higher, still recording. Darius had that look in his eye. Fierce, rebellious. Marlon knew that look. He'd seen it in boys growing up in neighborhoods like this, boys tired of being treated like criminals just for existing. "Why you acting like this, man?" Marlon asked the officer, his tone even but edged with exhaustion. "I'm just doing my job. These kids didn't do anything." The officer grunted. "If everything's in order, this won't take long. But I gotta make sure you are who you say you are." Marlon exhaled slowly. "Everything is in order," he repeated quietly. "You know that." The other officer circled back around and crossed his arms. "Maybe. Maybe not. We've got procedures and we follow them." Marlon could see it now. This wasn't about procedures. It never was. It was about control. The officers had the power here, and they were making sure everyone, especially Marlon, knew it. Marlon's voice remained low but firm. "This isn't necessary." The buzz-cut officer stepped closer, standing uncomfortably near, his breath heavy with authority. "I'll decide what's necessary," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Hands back on the hood." Marlon complied, glancing sideways just long enough to see Darius holding his phone higher, still recording. That look in Darius's eyes, fierce, rebellious, was one Marlon knew well. He had seen it in boys from his neighborhood, boys tired of being treated like criminals just for existing. "Why are you acting like this, man?" Marlon asked, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "I'm just doing my job," the officer grunted. "These kids didn't do anything. If everything's in order, this won't take long," the officer continued. "But I need to make sure you are who you say you are." Marlon inhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. "Everything is in order, you know that." The other officer, the one with the thick mustache, circled back and crossed his arms. "Maybe, maybe not. We've got procedures and we follow them." Marlon could see it now. This wasn't about procedures. It never was. It was about control. The officers had power, and they were making sure everyone, especially Marlon, knew it. Inside the bus, fear spread like wildfire. Leela, usually the quiet one, clutched her book tightly to her chest, her face pale. "Are they going to arrest Mr. Dahl?" she whispered to the girl next to her. Darius leaned into the aisle. "Nah, they're just trying to scare him." Marcus, the class clown, wasn't joking this time. "They're not just scaring him, they're messing with us too." Marlon could hear the kids whispering, their voices carrying through the open bus door. It broke something inside him. They shouldn't have to see this. They shouldn't have to witness him being treated like a suspect simply because of the color of his skin. The officer with the mustache stepped back and exchanged a look with his partner. "You know what? I think we're going to need to take this guy in for further questioning, just to be safe." Marlon's stomach dropped. "You can't do that," he said firmly. "I've got kids on this bus. I'm their driver. Their parents are waiting for them at school. You can't just take me in." "We'll find them another driver," the mustached officer said with a shrug. "Meanwhile, you're coming with us." The tension in the bus reached a breaking point. Darius stood up, still filming. "You're not taking Mr. D. He didn't do anything." The buzz-cut officer whipped around. "Sit down, kid, or I'll—" "You'll what?" Darius shot back, his defiance unwavering. "Arrest me too?" The officer stormed toward the bus door, his jaw tight with frustration, but Marlon quickly stepped between them, blocking his path. "That's enough," Marlon barked, his voice carrying a weight that made even the officer pause. The officer glared at him, his hands balled into fists. "Next," Marlon repeated, enunciating every word. "You're not laying a hand on them." The pirate was afraid of that. The officer's face twisted with irritation, but he didn't move. Behind Marlon, Darius kept the camera rolling, refusing to back down. The tension in the air was electric, crackling like a storm about to break. Finally, the mustached officer sighed. "Let's wrap this up before things get out of hand." Marlon exhaled slowly, the knot in his stomach tightening. Things were already out of hand, but at least for now the kids were safe. The officers conferred briefly, speaking in low voices Marlon couldn't quite make out. After a moment, the mustached officer turned back toward him. "All right," he said grudgingly, "you can go. But next time, watch yourself." "We'll be watching." Marlon bit back a retort and gave a stiff nod. "Sure." The officers turned and walked back to their patrol car. Marlon stood still for a moment, his muscles tense, his body aching from holding himself back. Then, slowly, he walked toward the bus, every step heavy with exhaustion. The kids watched him, their faces filled with a mixture of worry and anger. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel a little too tightly. "You okay, Mr. Day?" Darius asked quietly from the back. Marlon forced a smile, though it felt like his face was made of stone. "You're okay," he said, voice tight. He turned the key and the engine rumbled to life. "All right," he said, trying to make his voice sound normal, like nothing had happened. "Let's get to school." But everything had changed. He could feel it in the silence that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. And as he drove, his mind raced. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marlon told himself he was okay, but deep down he knew he wasn't. Not really. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But the worst part wasn't what they had done to him. It was the fact that the kids, those bright, hopeful kids, had been forced to witness it. They had seen everything. They had felt it. He started the bus, the engine rumbling beneath him like a steady but strained heartbeat. "All right, let's get to school," he said, forcing his voice to sound normal, like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The silence in the bus was suffocating, thick with the weight of what they had just experienced. The usual laughter and chatter were gone, replaced by hushed whispers and exchanged glances. Marlon kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marlon pulled into the school parking lot, gripping the wheel tighter than usual. As the kids filed off the bus, there was no usual rush of conversation, no playful shoving or lingering jokes. They stepped down in silence, still processing what they had just lived through. Darius was the last to leave. He turned back, giving Marlon a slow nod of respect, his phone still clutched in his hand. Marlon forced a small smile in return, but inside he felt like a balloon stretched too thin, ready to burst. By the time he parked the bus and made his way to the driver's lounge, the weight of everything hit him like a brick. This wasn't just another police stop. This was different. The kids had been involved. They had seen everything. Worse, They had felt it. Marlon knew moments like these could leave permanent marks on young minds, shaping their fears, their understanding of the world, and their place in it. He slumped into a chair at a worn-out table, gripping a bottle of water he couldn't bring himself to open. His phone vibrated with a steady stream of messages. At first he thought it might be from Angela or Jamal, but as he scrolled, his stomach dropped. One message read, "Did this really happen?" Attached was a link. Marlon clicked it and his heart clenched as the video loaded. The thumbnail alone made his chest tighten, the officer shouting, Marlon with his hands on the hood of the bus, and Darius filming from the aisle. The video was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It had already been shared thousands of times and the comments were relentless. What the hell is wrong with these cops? That man was just doing his job. Fire those officers now. This is why we can't trust the system. Every refresh brought more messages, more outrage. His phone buzzed nonstop. Activists had picked up the video, and protests were already being organized outside the police precinct. News stations had begun airing the footage, calling it yet another case of racial profiling. Marlon was still trying to process it all when his phone rang. It was the school principal. "Marlon, we've got parents calling in. They saw the video." "I figured they would," Marlon replied, keeping his voice as neutral as possible, even as the knot in his stomach tightened. "They're furious," the principal continued. "They want answers. Some are already on their way to the school." Marlon ran a hand over his face. "What do you need me to do?" "Just come by the main office. They want to talk to you." When Marlon reached the front office, several parents were already there. Some were pacing. Others sat with crossed arms, their faces tense. As soon as he stepped inside, a few parents approached him with gratitude. "Thank you for staying calm and keeping the kids safe," one mother said, gripping his hand tightly. "My boy told me everything. You stood up for them. Thank you." Marlon nodded, the words heavy on his tongue. But not all parents were as composed. One father stormed toward him, waving his phone. "You gonna tell me why my kid had to sit through this nonsense?" he demanded. "You think this is okay?" Before Marlon could respond, another parent stepped between them. "Wait. Oh, hold up," she interjected. "That wasn't his fault. You saw the video. They went after him for no reason." The tension in the room cracked like thunder as arguments broke out. Voices rose, parents snapping at each other, their emotions spilling over. The principal finally raised his hands. "Please," he called out. "We're all on the same side here. Let's focus on what matters, making sure this doesn't happen again." Outside, protests had already begun. A small crowd had gathered in front of the police precinct, carrying signs that read, "Fire the officers" and "Justice for Marlon." News vans lined the street, and reporters jostled for space. Darius, never one to stay quiet, had joined the protesters. He held a hand-painted sign above his head, his expression set with determination. A reporter approached him with a microphone, and Darius didn't hesitate. "Mr. D always looked out for us," he said, his voice steady despite the fire in his eyes. "He didn't deserve what happened today. None of us did." His words spread like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags like "Justice for Marlon" and "Respect our drivers" were trending across social media. Back in the school office, Marlon's phone buzzed again. This time it was Angela. "Baby," she said, worry thick in her voice. "I saw the video. Jamal saw it too. He's furious." "I'm okay," Marlon assured her, though the exhaustion was clear in his tone. Angela sighed. "You're a good man, Marlon. I just hate that they keep doing this to you." He whispered. "Me too." The day stretched on, and by nightfall the protest outside the precinct had only grown. More parents, more students, more voices demanding justice. The police chief issued a brief statement, calling the officers' actions under review. But that wasn't enough. People wanted action. As Marlon sat at the edge of his bed that night, the enormity of the day settled over him like a thick fog. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every child on that bus, every black man who had ever been unjustly profiled, every person who had ever been forced to stay silent. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from Darius. "You always told us to stand up for what's right. Just following your lead, Mr. D." Marlon exhaled slowly, his chest loosening just a little. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to smile. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But now, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. That read, "Our driver, our hero." A local reporter approached Darius for an interview, and he didn't hesitate. "Mr. D always looked out for us," he told the camera, his voice steady despite the fire in his eyes. "He didn't deserve what happened today, none of us did." The interview spread like wildfire. Within hours, "Justice for Marlon" and "Respect our drivers" were trending across social media. People from all over the country shared the video, outraged by what had happened. Meanwhile, Marlon's phone buzzed again. This time it was from a familiar number. "Angela," he answered. "Angela? You okay, baby?" Her voice was filled with worry. "I saw the video. Jamal saw it too. He called me. He's furious." "I'm okay," Marlon assured her, though the exhaustion in his tone made it clear that wasn't entirely true. "It's been a day." "You're a good man, Marlon. I just hate that they keep doing this to you." "Care," Marlon whispered. "Me too." The day dragged on, and as the sun set, the protest outside the precinct only grew louder. More parents and students joined, standing in solidarity with Marlon. The street was filled with chants demanding justice, and news crews captured every moment. The police chief finally issued a brief statement, calling the officers' actions under review, but that wasn't enough for the crowd. They demanded accountability, not empty promises. As Marlon sat on the edge of his bed that night, exhaustion pressed down on him like a heavy weight. The enormity of the day settled over him, thick like fog. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every child on that bus, every person who had ever felt the sting of unjust suspicion. His phone buzzed one last time before he set it aside. A message from Darius. "You always told us to stand up for what's right. Just following your lead, Mr. D." Marlon exhaled slowly, the tight knot in his chest loosening just a bit. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to smile. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least he knew he wasn't standing alone. The next morning, the morning after the protests, Marlon woke to the sound of his phone buzzing non-stop on the bedside table. Messages poured in from everywhere. Journalists asking for interviews, parents sending words of support, activists urging him to join their cause. He felt the weight of it all before his feet even hit the floor. Angela stood in the doorway, arms crossed, concern etched into her face. "Marlon, you need to see the news." He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes as Angela handed him her phone. The screen showed a live broadcast from the local station. Overnight, protests outside the precinct grew larger as community members demanded justice for Marlon Davis, the school bus driver stopped and humiliated by police in front of children, the reporter announced. The police department has released a statement saying the officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. However, the public is calling for immediate firings. Marlon handed the phone back with a sigh. "They're just trying to cover themselves," he muttered. Angela sat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They know they messed up. They just don't want to admit it." He nodded slowly, feeling both exhausted and restless. The situation had spiraled beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a symbol, another reminder of the systemic injustice that people like him faced every day. Later that morning, Marlon's phone rang again. The school principal. "Marlon, I need you to come in," the principal said, his voice careful. "There's something you should see." When Marlon arrived at the school, a crowd had gathered outside. Parents, students, and community members filled the front lawn, holding signs that called for justice. But when he stepped inside, he wasn't prepared for what awaited him in the school auditorium. A group of students stood on the stage, holding a large banner that read, "We stand with Mr. D." Darius stepped forward and took the microphone. "We're here today because what happened to Mr. D wasn't just wrong," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It was unacceptable. He's always been there for us. Now it's our turn to stand up for him." The room erupted in applause. Marlon felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years making sure those kids felt safe on his bus, and now they were making sure he knew he wasn't alone. As parents and students lined up to shake his hand, Marlon felt something shift. This wasn't just about one traffic stop. This was about change, and it had already begun. The crowd outside the school was electric, voices rising in unison as they chanted for justice. The energy in the air was charged, not just with anger, but with hope. These were not just protesters. They were parents, students, and community members standing together for something they believed in. As Marlon stepped toward the school doors, the principal met him with a firm but encouraging expression. "Come on," he said, leading Marlon down the hallway toward the auditorium. "The kids wanted to do something for you." Marlon followed, his heart heavy with anticipation. He had spent years driving these students to and from school, looking out for them like they were his own. Now, for the first time, they were standing up for him. When he entered the auditorium, the sight before him took his breath away. Banners reading "Our Driver, Our Hero" stretched across the stage. The students, his students, had organized a rally in his honor. Darius stood at the microphone, his usual playful demeanor replaced with solemn determination. He took a deep breath, scanning the crowd before speaking. "We're here today because what happened to Mr. D was wrong," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He's always been there for us. Now it's our turn to be there for him." The auditorium erupted in applause. Marlon sat in the front row, overwhelmed by the support. His eyes stung, but he blinked back the tears. These kids, his kids, weren't backing down. They weren't just witnesses to injustice. They were fighting against it. After the rally, parents approached him, some with tears in their eyes, others with words of encouragement. "We've got your back, Marlon," one mother said, gripping his hand tightly. "You're part of this community, and we won't let them treat you like this." Marlon nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered. The support gave him strength, but he knew the fight wasn't over. That afternoon, Marlon's phone rang again. This time, it was the police chief. "Marlon," the chief began, his voice stiff but measured. "I wanted to apologize personally for what happened. I've reviewed the footage and I agree. It was unacceptable." Marlon listened in silence. "We're going to release a public apology," the chief continued. "The officers involved will be dismissed. I just wanted to tell you first." Marlon exhaled slowly, feeling his body finally relax for the first time in days. "Thank you," he said simply. It wasn't a victory, at least not entirely, but it was a step in the right direction. That evening, the community gathered outside the police precinct for a candlelight vigil. Marlon stood among them, Angela by his side. The flickering flames cast a warm, golden glow across the faces of parents, students, and neighbors who had come to show their support. As the night settled around them, it was Marlon's turn to speak. He stepped forward, his heart full. Looking out at the sea of faces before him, he saw the kids from his bus, the parents who had fought for him, the activists who had amplified their voices, and even strangers who had been moved by the video. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began, his voice steady. "But I want to thank each and every one of you, not just for standing up for me, but for standing up for what's right." He paused, his eyes finding Darius in the crowd. "This fight isn't over," he continued. "But today, we took a step forward, and as long as we keep standing together, we'll keep moving forward." Applause erupted, echoing into the night. As Marlon stepped back, Angela squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. He gave her a small, grateful smile. The next morning, Marlon returned to his bus. His usual route awaited him, just like every other morning, but everything felt different now. As he pulled up to the first stop, Darius was already there, waiting with a grin. "Ready for another ride, Mr. D?" he asked as he climbed aboard, his phone tucked away this time. Marlon chuckled, feeling warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't had in days. "Always ready, kid," he said. "Let's get moving." The other kids piled onto the bus, their usual energy restored. The chatter and laughter filled the space, creating that familiar hum of normalcy. As Marlon navigated the familiar streets, he reflected on everything that had happened. The anger, the protests, the fear. It had all been real, but so was the support, so was the solidarity, so was the strength he had seen in the people around him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced prejudice. The system wouldn't change overnight. There would be more challenges ahead. But now, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not just for himself, but for the kids on his bus, for the community that had rallied behind him, for everyone fighting the same battle. As the bus rolled toward the school, Marlon glanced in the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of the kids. They weren't just passengers on his route. They were his responsibility, his joy, and his reason to keep going. He smiled to himself. "We're going to be okay." Because for every obstacle thrown his way, Marlon knew one thing for certain. He wasn't facing it alone. The story of Marlon Davis teaches us the power of standing up for what is right, even in the face of injustice. His students' courage to speak out against unfair treatment shows that change begins when people refuse to stay silent. It reminds us that our voices matter, and unity can bring about real action. This story is also a lesson in resilience. Marlon remained calm despite the humiliation, setting an example of strength and dignity. In life, we must support one another, challenge discrimination, and create a future where respect and fairness are not privileges, but rights for all. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new episodes. We have many more exciting stories to come. Go to the next video and discover more inspiring stories. See you in the next installment.